There is a photograph of Howard Hughes taken late in his life that almost nobody talks about. Not the glamorous ones, not the images beside aircraft prototypes or Hollywood actresses, not the smiling young millionaire standing beside a gleaming plane with oil money behind him and ambition burning through his face. This photograph is different. It was taken through a hotel window in Las Vegas. The curtains are half drawn. The room is dark even though it is daytime. Hughes is impossibly thin. His hair hangs long around his face. His fingernails have grown out, curled and yellowed. Tissues are stacked in boxes around the room, like barricades against an invisible enemy. He is sitting alone, watching television with the sound turned low, his eyes distant, as though looking at something no one else could see. By then, he owned casinos, airlines, patents, real estate, and enough money to alter the politics of entire states. And yet he was terrified of touching a doorknob, terrified of germs, terrified of people, terrified perhaps most of all of himself. This is the story of Howard Hughes, and it is not the story most people think they know. Most people remember the legend, the billionaire aviator, the Hollywood producer, the man who dated movie stars and flew faster than anyone alive, the eccentric genius, the American original, the man who seemed to have conquered every frontier available to a human being in the 20th century. But the final chapter of his life was something quieter and far sadder. For nearly 15 years, Hughes lived almost entirely sealed away from the world. He drifted between darkened hotel suites, guarded by employees who rarely saw daylight themselves. He stopped cutting his hair, stopped speaking to friends, stopped trusting nearly everyone around him, stopped, in many ways, living in any recognizable sense of the word. He became a ghost haunting the empire he built. And somewhere inside all that silence was a question that followed him from childhood onward. What happens when a man spends his entire life trying to control everything, and then discovers he cannot control his own mind? The answer took decades to unfold, but when it finally arrived, it looked like a skeletal figure hiding behind hotel curtains in the desert, ruling an empire he would never see again. The boy from nowhere. Howard Robard Hughes Jr. was born on Christmas Eve in 1905 in Houston, Texas. His father was a hard, inventive businessman who made a fortune designing drill bits for the oil industry. Howard Sr. was relentless, driven, the kind of man who saw problems as things to be dominated rather than negotiated with. He built his company with ruthless efficiency and expected the world to bend around his will. His mother, Aline, was the opposite in temperament, but equally intense. She was deeply anxious, intensely protective, and terrified that illness lurked everywhere, waiting to snatch away everything she loved. That mattered more than people realize. From an early age, Howard grew up in a household shaped by fear. His mother monitored his health obsessively. She worried about contamination, disease, strangers, public spaces, germs on doorknobs, illnesses carried by other children. She reportedly inspected him for signs of sickness with almost ritualistic concern, checking his temperature, examining his skin, asking him repeatedly how he felt. It was love, of course, but love wrapped around fear becomes something else entirely. Children absorb emotional atmospheres long before they understand them. They learn what the world feels like before they learn what it means. And Hughes absorbed fear. Not loud fear, not dramatic fear, quiet fear. The kind that hides itself behind control. The kind that teaches a child that safety comes from vigilance, from order, from keeping the chaos of the world at a measurable distance. By all accounts, Howard was intelligent, mechanically gifted, and emotionally isolated. He loved machines because machines made sense. Machines obeyed laws. Machines could be understood, predicted, mastered. Human beings did not offer those certainties. And perhaps that was the beginning of everything, because even as a boy, Hughes seemed more comfortable with systems than with people, more comfortable building than belonging, more at ease in the logic of engines than in the mystery of relationships. He was educated erratically, moving between schools, never quite fitting in. Some teachers recognized his brilliance, others saw only a withdrawn, difficult child who resisted authority and seemed trapped inside his own head. There are stories of young Howard taking apart radios, building makeshift motorcycles, sketching aircraft designs before he could legally drive. He was always building something, always trying to make something work better, faster, more efficiently, as though the act of creation itself offered relief from something he could not name. Then, one after another, the foundations disappeared beneath him. His mother died suddenly when he was 17. The loss shattered something inside him. The woman who had defined safety, who had taught him that the world was dangerous, who had wrapped her anxieties around him like armor, was gone. His father died less than 2 years later. By 18, Howard Hughes was effectively alone, extremely wealthy, but alone. And that combination, massive power arriving before emotional stability, unlimited resources landing in the hands of someone still figuring out who they were, would define the rest of his life. There is something almost unbearably modern about him in retrospect. A young man with unlimited resources and no real boundaries. No one capable of telling him no. No one capable of slowing him down. No parents. No mentors strong enough to resist his will. Just money, ambition, and a vast unspoken fear he had inherited and never learned to name. But what did Howard Hughes actually want? Not the headlines, not the glamour. What was underneath all that motion? The answer seems to have been simple and impossible. He wanted mastery, over machines, over risk, over fear, over death itself. And for a while, it almost looked possible. Hollywood and the performance of greatness. When Hughes arrived in Los Angeles in the 1920s, he entered a city that rewarded performance above almost everything else. And Howard Hughes understood performance instinctively. He understood that public life was theatre, that identity could be constructed. That success in America often depended on becoming larger than human, on transforming yourself into a symbol people could project their fantasies onto. He was tall, handsome, wealthy, and young. He had the kind of face that looked good in newspapers, the kind of story that columnists loved, orphaned millionaire seeking adventure in the land of make-believe. He produced films with reckless ambition and endless spending. His 1930 aviation epic, Hell's Angels, became one of the most expensive movies ever made at the time. He obsessed over aerial combat sequences, hiring real pilots, crashing real planes, reshooting scenes dozens of times. The production nearly destroyed him financially. Instead, it made him famous. Hollywood loved men who behaved like myths, men who spent fortunes chasing impossible visions, men who treated money as though it was simply another material to be bent toward their will. And Hughes leaned into the role completely. He dated some of the most famous women in the world: Katharine Hepburn, Ava Gardner, Jean Harlow, Ginger Rogers, Betty Davis, and many others. Gossip columns transformed him into a kind of American prince, wealthy, mysterious, daring, untouchable. He was photographed at premieres, at nightclubs, stepping out of planes with beautiful women on his arm. The public consumed the image hungrily. But even then, there were signs that the machinery inside him was running too hot. He worked obsessively, barely slept, fixated on perfection, repeated scenes endlessly, micromanaged details nobody else noticed or cared about. Employees learned quickly that Hughes could become consumed by tiny imperfections for days at a time. A shadow in a shot, the angle of a cloud, the sound of an engine that only he could hear was wrong. People around him often mistook this for genius. Sometimes it was. But obsession and brilliance can resemble each other from a distance, and the line between visionary persistence and pathological compulsion is thinner than most people want to admit. His relationships with women were intense but unstable. He could be charming, generous, attentive. He could also be controlling, jealous, and emotionally absent. Katharine Hepburn later described him as someone capable of great tenderness, who nevertheless seemed fundamentally unreachable, as though a part of him remained permanently sealed off. Several women spoke of his strange habits even then, his need for silence, his peculiar routines, the way he would sometimes disappear for days without explanation. He was building something even in those early years, not just films or fame, but walls. And what happened when that restless, relentless energy collided with aviation? Howard Hughes did not simply love flying. He loved the confrontation with death. Flying gave him something few other experiences could: absolute concentration, absolute control, absolute escape from the messy, unpredictable chaos of ordinary life. In the cockpit, everything made sense. Instruments could be read, physics could be trusted, danger could be calculated. He set airspeed records, pushing planes to their limits and beyond. He flew across the United States in record time. He circled the globe faster than anyone before him, landing to crowds that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. He designed aircraft with revolutionary ambition, working with engineers to create planes that were faster, sleeker, more advanced than anything else in the sky. To the public, he became the embodiment of American futurism, a handsome millionaire racing ahead of the century itself, a man who seemed to have conquered fear and transformed it into velocity. But privately, his inner life was becoming increasingly unstable. Because Hughes wasn't just chasing achievement anymore, he was chasing relief. Relief from anxiety, from the silence in his head, from the formless dread that had been planted in childhood and never stopped growing. And the problem with chasing relief through achievement is that the relief never lasts. The record gets broken, the applause fades, the plane lands, and then you are alone again with yourself. The crash. In 1946, Howard Hughes took off in an experimental military reconnaissance aircraft called the XF-11. The flight should never have happened. The aircraft had known mechanical concerns. Engineers advised caution. Test pilots suggested delays. Hughes insisted on piloting it anyway. He always did. Because risk for Hughes was never something to be avoided, it was something to be mastered, and mastery required confrontation. Soon after takeoff, disaster struck. A propeller malfunctioned. The plane became unstable. Hughes struggled with the controls as the aircraft dropped altitude over Los Angeles. Witnesses on the ground watched in horror as the plane screamed overhead, trailing smoke, losing height, clearly doomed. The plane crashed violently into a neighborhood in Beverly Hills, smashing through a house and erupting in flames. Witnesses thought nobody could survive. But Hughes did survive. Barely. His skull fractured, his ribs shattered, his lungs collapsed, his heart was pushed to the edge of failure. Doctors pumped blood from his chest while his body drifted toward shock. They did not expect him to live through the night. Then they did not expect him to live through the week. But he lived. Though what came afterward could hardly be called living in the fullest sense. The physical pain that followed the crash would become one of the hidden engines of the rest of his life. Because after the crash, Hughes became deeply dependent on painkillers, particularly codeine, and later stronger opiates. The injuries never truly healed. His body remained a map of fractures and nerve damage. Pain became a constant companion, sometimes dull, sometimes blinding, always present. And the drugs that dulled the pain also changed his mind. Friends noticed changes. His moods darkened, his compulsions intensified, his distrust deepened, his temper became unpredictable. The crash became more than an accident, it became a dividing line. Before it, Hughes was eccentric. After it, he began drifting towards something closer to madness. But there was another layer to this story, something psychological rather than pharmaceutical. Howard Hughes had spent decades constructing an image of invincibility, the fearless aviator, the industrial genius, the man who conquered risk, the man who bent the world to his will. The crash exposed something terrifying beneath that identity. He was vulnerable, fragile, mortal, breakable, and Hughes did not cope well with vulnerability. So instead of retreating from control, instead of accepting limitation, instead of letting people help him heal, he pursued control more aggressively than ever. He controlled rooms, conversations, lighting, food, schedules, temperature, employees, silence. Eventually he would try to control bacteria themselves, as though enough rituals could hold chaos back forever, as though perfection in procedure could compensate for the fragility of flesh. The germs, the darkness, and the rules. Mental illness rarely arrives all at once. It accumulates quietly. A preference becomes a habit becomes a ritual becomes a necessity becomes a prison. By the 1950s and 1960s, Hughes's obsessive-compulsive behaviors had become severe and all-consuming. He washed obsessively, scrubbing his hands until the skin cracked and bled. He demanded that objects be handled with tissues, sometimes multiple layers of tissues, following elaborate procedures he invented and refined constantly. He created written instructions for employees on how to open cans, serve food, touch surfaces, move objects from one place to another. These instructions sometimes ran to dozens of pages, filled with diagrams, specifications, warnings. He became increasingly reclusive, avoiding public appearances, cancelling meetings, withdrawing from friends. Rooms were kept dark, curtains drawn even during the day, windows sealed against outside air, temperature controlled to exact specifications. Television flickered constantly in the background, providing noise, companionship, distraction from thoughts he could not silence. He watched films repeatedly for days at a time, sometimes the same film dozens of times in a row. Sometimes he sat naked, his body skeletal, his attention fixed on the screen. Sometimes he went days without sleeping, sometimes weeks without speaking to anyone except through written notes. There are accounts from employees who described entering rooms filled with stacked milk bottles, untouched food trays, handwritten notes covering every surface, the air stale and strange. The richest man in America living like a man under siege, and perhaps he was, but not from the outside world, from his own mind. The obsessions multiplied and evolved. He became convinced that germs were everywhere, invisible enemies waiting to invade his body. He developed elaborate procedures for decontamination. Employees had to wash their hands multiple times before touching anything he might touch. Objects had to be wrapped in tissue, placed in specific locations, handled according to precise instructions. If the procedure was violated, even slightly, the entire process had to begin again, and again, and again, until it was perfect. Except it was never perfect, because the fear was never really about germs, it was about control, and control was the one thing his mind would never give him. There is a tendency to romanticize eccentricity when it belongs to powerful men. Society often treats breakdown differently when wealth surrounds it. If an ordinary person locks themselves in dark rooms for months, people call it illness. If a billionaire does it, people sometimes call it genius. They call it vision. They call it the price of brilliance. But Howard Hughes was suffering, profoundly. And the tragedy is that his wealth insulated him from intervention. There were always employees willing to obey him, no matter how strange the orders became. Always lawyers willing to protect him from scrutiny. Always executives willing to accommodate the impossible, because accommodating Hughes meant keeping their jobs, their power, their access to his empire. Money can purchase privacy, but privacy can become a coffin when nobody is allowed inside. And what happened when Hughes finally withdrew almost completely from the world, when the door closed and the curtains drew shut and the silence became absolute? The empire kept growing, but the man disappeared. The Desert Kingdom. In the late 1960s, Hughes moved into the Desert Inn Hotel in Las Vegas. At first, management assumed he was another wealthy guest, eccentric perhaps, but nothing they had not seen before in a city built on excess and spectacle. Then weeks passed, then months. Hughes occupied the entire top floor. He never left. Employees brought food, removed trash, followed increasingly bizarre instructions delivered through handwritten notes and intermediaries. Eventually the hotel asked him to leave. They needed the space. High rollers were waiting. This was business. So Hughes simply bought the hotel. That became the pattern. When something inconvenienced him, he purchased it. When something threatened his privacy, he acquired it. When the world pressed against his boundaries, he expanded those boundaries with money. Casinos, hotels, television stations, land, airlines, mining claims. Entire sections of Las Vegas began falling under his influence. Transactions conducted entirely through intermediaries. Contracts signed by people who had never seen him. Business empires shifting ownership based on notes written in dark rooms by a man most employees had never met. At one point, Hughes owned so much of the city that local politics shifted around him like iron filings around a magnet. Decisions about development, licensing, regulation were influenced by his presence, his money, his invisible hand. Senators took his calls. Governors visited his representatives. The CIA used his companies as cover for covert operations. He had become a kind of shadow government, powerful precisely because he was unseen. And yet, the strange contradiction remained. The more power he acquired publicly, the smaller his private world became. He lived almost entirely inside sealed suites guarded by loyal aides, later known as the Mormon Mafia, a group of assistants who managed every detail of his existence. They were chosen partly for their loyalty, partly for their willingness to follow orders without question, and partly because Hughes believed Mormons did not drink or smoke, making them somehow cleaner, safer, more trustworthy. Meals arrived under strict procedures, prepared according to specifications, delivered at exact times. Conversations were filtered through layers of intermediaries. Documents were reviewed obsessively, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. Employees sometimes received bizarre instructions written in all capital letters, notes that rambled for pages about how to open a door or move a chair or handle a glass. Howard Hughes became both emperor and prisoner. The hotels changed ownership. The cities transformed around him. But the rooms stayed the same. Dark, silent, controlled. Temperature regulated. Sound minimized. Light eliminated. And somewhere inside those rooms was a man who had once flown across oceans, chasing speed, chasing records, chasing the edge of what was possible. Now frightened by fingerprints, terrified of air, imprisoned by his own procedures. But what did isolation do to him over time? It distorted reality. The fewer people Hughes trusted, the more influence fell to the small circle surrounding him. And that circle was not always benevolent. Some were loyal, some were protective. Some saw a vulnerable man who needed help. Others saw opportunity. Rumors multiplied about exploitation, about aides controlling access, about business decisions made by people pretending to speak for Hughes, about money disappearing into schemes he never understood. Legal battles intensified, competitors circled, governments investigated. And through it all, Hughes remained hidden, a ghost at the center of a vast machine that kept running whether he was conscious or not. Some people exploited him, others pitied him. Many simply stopped knowing how to reach him. And perhaps the saddest part is this: Howard Hughes spent years trying to disappear while the entire world remained obsessed with finding him. Journalists camped outside his hotels, photographers bribed employees for pictures, tabloids printed wild speculation, books were written by people who had never met him. The myth grew larger as the man grew smaller. The man nobody could reach. As the 1970s approached, Hughes's condition deteriorated dramatically. He weighed shockingly little, perhaps 90 pounds on a 6'4" frame, his body skeletal, his skin pale and papery. His body weakened from malnutrition, drug addiction, and medical neglect. He rarely cut his nails or hair. Photographs from this period, the few that exist, show a figure barely recognizable as human, more like something from a nightmare than a boardroom. Medical care became inconsistent because he distrusted doctors almost as much as he distrusted strangers. He refused treatments, rejected procedures, ignored symptoms that would have alarmed anyone else. He was dying slowly, and he seemed unable or unwilling to stop it. Former lovers spoke about him with sadness rather than anger when reporters asked. Katharine Hepburn remembered flashes of warmth beneath the paranoia. Ava Gardner recalled his sense of humor. Others mentioned his curiosity, his unexpected kindness, his ability to listen when he chose to. That is often what makes stories like this so difficult. People are rarely one thing entirely. Howard Hughes was not simply a tyrant or a genius or a victim or a monster. He was a frightened human being, amplified by unimaginable wealth and unimaginable power. A man whose illnesses unfolded in private because his status allowed them to, because money built walls that compassion could not penetrate. There is an image from his later years that lingers painfully in the memory, described by employees who were there. Hughes sitting alone in a darkened screening room, watching the same films repeatedly while aides waited outside for instructions that sometimes never came. An aging billionaire surrounded by projected images of younger, happier versions of life. Flickering stories of romance, adventure, heroism, worlds he had once inhabited and could no longer recognize. As though cinema itself had become a hiding place. And maybe it had. Movies allowed him to revisit worlds he could no longer inhabit, worlds where people still touched each other casually, where sunlight entered rooms without fear, where ambition still felt exciting instead of exhausting, where control had not yet turned into captivity. But eventually even fantasy began collapsing around him. By the early 1970s, Hughes had become less a person in the public imagination than a rumor, a legend, a ghost story told in boardrooms and bars. Sightings triggered headlines. Photographs, even blurry or questionable ones, became tabloid gold. People debated whether he was insane, dying, manipulated, or already gone. Conspiracy theories multiplied. Some claimed he had died years earlier and was being impersonated. Others insisted he was being held prisoner by his own staff. A few believed he had orchestrated his own disappearance as part of some larger plan. And, in a sense, parts of him already were gone. The daring pilot who set records, the charming producer who courted actresses, the young millionaire intoxicated by possibility, the man who believed he could outrun fear by flying faster than it could follow. What remained was a man exhausted by his own mind, trapped in rituals that promised safety but delivered only repetition, living in darkness because light had become unbearable. The final flight. In April 1976, Howard Hughes was dying. His aides knew it. His doctors, the few allowed near him, knew it. Perhaps Hughes himself knew it, though by then his grasp on reality had become difficult to measure. He was being transported by aeroplane from Acapulco, where he had been living in another sealed hotel suite, to medical treatment in Houston, the city where he had been born 70 years earlier. The irony was impossible to ignore. One of the most famous aviators in history, a man who had set speed records and circled the globe, reduced to a frail passenger, barely recognizable even to authorities. He weighed around 90 pounds. His body was covered in bed sores, marked by needle tracks, emaciated to the point of horror. His hair and beard had grown long, white and unkempt. When the plane landed and officials tried to identify him, they struggled to believe this skeletal figure was Howard Hughes. The empire remained enormous, vast, generating millions. But the man himself had almost vanished, consumed from within by fear and chemistry and time. Howard Hughes died on April 5, 1976, somewhere over Texas. He was 70 years old. And even after death, chaos followed. Legal disputes exploded over his fortune, which was estimated in the billions. Handwritten wills appeared mysteriously, some obviously forged, others impossible to verify. One claimed to leave money to a gas station attendant who had once helped Hughes. Another surfaced in Mormon church archives. Relatives who had not seen him in decades emerged to claim inheritance. Executives battled over control of his companies. Institutions, governments and opportunists fought over pieces of what he had built. The machine Hughes constructed continued operating exactly as giant systems often do after their creators disappear, coldly, relentlessly, indifferently. But beyond the legal drama and corporate aftermath was a simpler truth. A lonely man had died after spending years hidden from almost everyone who had ever cared about him. Not in a roaring blaze of aviation glory, not in a Hollywood mansion surrounded by admirers, not in the arms of the beautiful women who had once loved him, but in isolation, surrounded by employees, high above the earth in a plane, drifting between one dark room and another. And perhaps that ending was always hidden somewhere inside the beginning. The anxious child watching his mother check him for illness, the obsession with control born from fear, the terror of contamination learned before he understood what contamination meant, the emotional solitude that made machines easier to love than people, all of it forming quietly beneath the myth America preferred to see. What he left behind. Howard Hughes left behind airlines that still carry passengers across continents, patents that shaped aviation technology for generations, films that are still watched and studied, casinos and hotels that transformed Las Vegas from a desert outpost into a capital of American fantasy, medical research institutes funded by his fortune, engineering innovations that pushed the boundaries of what aircraft could do. He reshaped industries. He influenced politics. He became a symbol of 20th century ambition pushed to impossible extremes, a reminder of what human will, combined with unlimited resources, could accomplish. He also left behind cautionary lessons about power, isolation, addiction, and untreated mental illness. Because wealth protected Hughes from consequences for a very long time, it protected him from intervention, from accountability, from the kind of honest confrontation that might have helped him, but it could not protect him from suffering. That is the uncomfortable truth at the center of his story. Money expanded his reach while shrinking his humanity. Fame magnified his image while eroding his privacy. Control became the answer to every fear until control itself consumed him, until the rituals designed to create safety became the bars of his prison. And still, despite everything, there remains something strangely heartbreaking about Howard Hughes. Perhaps because he represented a distinctly American dream taken to its furthest edge, the belief that brilliance, determination, and money could conquer human limitation, that wealth could purchase freedom from fear, that achievement could silence the frightened voice inside, that if you flew fast enough, high enough, far enough, you could outrun whatever was chasing you. But no empire is large enough to silence loneliness forever. No fortune is large enough to purchase peace of mind. No amount of achievement can entirely outrun the frightened child a person once was. And no amount of control can protect you from your own mind when that mind turns against you. In the end, Howard Hughes became exactly what he feared most. Not sick with some external disease, not betrayed by enemies, not destroyed by competitors or governments or bad luck, but trapped. Not by enemies, not by poverty, not by failure, but by the walls he spent a lifetime building around himself, brick by brick, ritual by ritual, fear by fear, until the walls were so high and so thick that no light could enter and no one could reach him, and he could no longer remember what he had been trying to protect. An improbable life, a legendary empire, a silent room in the desert, and a man sitting alone behind the curtains while the world waited outside, wondering what had happened to the brilliant young aviator who once seemed capable of anything. The photograph remains, the one almost nobody talks about, taken through hotel glass, through curtains, through layers of distance and time. A skeletal figure in darkness, surrounded by tissues and televisions and the vast, echoing silence of a mind at war with itself. That is how the story ends, not with speed or glory or triumph, but with a man who conquered the sky and could not conquer his own fear, who built an empire and died alone, who had everything the world said mattered, and nothing that actually did.